everyone, it's Opulence. Today I'd like to show you a really fun technique for creating a vintage look to your stamped images. These don't have to be stamped images either. You can do these to your toppers, for example, your pattern papers if you wish. So I've stamped my gorgeous floral detail stamp here. This is from my ures Opulence range. We'll make sure that is linked down below. I've stamped it onto a large sheet of thin cardstock and I'm just going to colour this in. I'm going to use my alcohol pens. I'm probably going to do a little bit of ink smooching in the background as well to give it a little bit of colour behind. That part isn't part of the technique. Like I say, you can do this with pre-coloured images if you prefer. So I'll get this done and then we'll come back and start the tutorial for getting the vintage look. So now my image is coloured in, I have started putting clear embossing ink all over the image. You want to be sure to cover the whole thing if you can. I'm using here, this is Versamark, this is a clear embossing ink, and I'm going to be putting over the top a clear embossing powder. Now I'm going to repeat this 3 or 4 times to get a really thick layer of embossing powder on there. So I've got a huge tub here, although you don't actually use as much powder as you probably think you would, but I've got a really big tub of embossing powder here, and I like to make sure every area is covered by just tipping it backwards and forwards, trying to keep as much of it in the pot as possible. Now I've got a thin coating of the powder on there. I'm going to heat set this. You can see from the effect the ink is having on the paper, it's starting to curl it, but it's absolutely fine. When I put it on my project, I will stick all of those layers down really well, so I'm not worried about that. So you'll have this gorgeous glossy effect, which is a beautiful effect on its own. But I'm, like I say, going to repeat this a few times until I've got a really thick layer of embossing powder on there. And don't forget to make sure you are going to the edges and not just focusing on the main image in the middle. After a few layers, you should have a really lovely thick glossy coating. Now if you use ultra thick embossing enamel or UT rather than ordinary clear and super fine embossing powder, you can do this probably in 1 or 2 layers. Now what I'm going to do is take this sheet and pop it in the freezer. Yeah, I'm going to put it in the freezer for about 10 minutes, just enough to really make it ever so cold. So I'll come back once I take this out. So this has had about 10 minutes in the freezer. It's really quite chilly now, obviously not frozen, but it's enough to cool down that enamel, and you can now start crinkling and cracking the embossing. So you want to start scrunching up the paper, and you'll notice that the embossing powder will actually crack rather than bend because it's so cold. So you want to do this all over in different directions and keep going until you've got as many cracks as you'd like. Now some areas you'll notice will actually, or potentially could actually tear. That's not an issue. That will only add to the vintage look, and this will all be kind of adhered down flat anyway. There, so I've got lots of creases and cracks now in my enamel as such, my clear embossing. So now I'm going to take a brown ink. This is a Distress Oxide. You could use a Distress ink, and I'm going to brush it over the surface of the embossing and over all those cracks. I've actually decided to go with Distress ink rather than Distress Oxide. It's getting into the cracks a lot better. You can use the oxide, but because the ink is a dye base, it's a thinner consistency, and it's easier to get into some of those cracks. And you want to really work this in with a brush, and ideally do try just moving your paper around to open the cracks up as you're inking over and around them. This will just allow the ink into them a little bit more. So most of the surface of the image will resist the inking, but of course where the cracks are, and you can still generate more if you find you've got an area that's quite plain, hasn't got many of these cracks in, you can create some new ones if you need. Then I'm just going to take a piece of kitchen towel and just buff away any excess ink, so we don't want the surface to actually be too discoloured. We want to easily be able to see our stamped image through. That's really distressed it, made it look ever so vintage, and it's got the cracks in as well. So let's trim this down, ready to go on a card. So I've just focused up nearer the camera for you so you can really see all those cracks and lines going through, and then the ink settling in them as well. And as I say, you could make lots more cracks if you wanted. If you got to this stage and decided there weren't actually enough, I've got a lot more at the top than I do have at the bottom, but here I can go ahead and crack that again, and then I can take the ink on my brush and I can just brush that in like so, and I've got myself another crack there in that direction too. So I just think this is such a beautiful technique for adding a really vintage feel to any stamped image. Now let's finish off this card. So I decided to trim the panel down, and I put it into one of the frames that comes from the Textures Opulence collection. So this is part of the same range that this gorgeous stamp is from. I've taken the second largest frame, and as you can see, I've just cut it from white cardstock, popped some gilding wax, gold gilding wax around it with my finger, buffed it in especially to the corners, and I've raised that up on foam. So it just looks like it's a sort of fractured glass there. It's so beautiful, and I love that I've just used a part of the image as well. Makes my card much smaller. A very small sentiment there. I could have used a larger sentiment or something from the same collection, but I chose to go with the Texture Sentiments for All label there. This is a paper pad where you can cut out any sentiment in black or white and pop it onto your card. It's just nice, simple, and it doesn't detract from all the detail in the background. Now, because I cut it down, I've still got this strip as well, so I can make myself a second card with this if I want to. So I really love that technique. There's a lot of detail there, a gorgeous vintage look. I hope you'll try this out. Let me know if you do. And you'll find all of these products up in this link just here. We would love it if you could subscribe to the CraftStash YouTube channel just here, and I think you're really going to love this video here too. Take care, everybody. I'll see you again very soon.